Every July, Americans celebrate freedom and independence. We wave flags, light fireworks, and proudly remind ourselves that no king has the right to rule us. Then on Sunday morning, tens of millions of Americans walk into church and enthusiastically proclaim, "Jesus is Lord, Christ is King, and I surrender everything to God." Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. So think about all of that for a moment. We've built an entire national identity around rejecting absolute rulers while simultaneously treating absolute submission to one invisible ruler as the highest possible virtue. If someone demanded that level of obedience in politics or business or even marriage, we'd call it authoritarianism. But wrap it in religious language and suddenly surrender becomes holy. That's the paradox I want to explore today. So let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. I don't think genuine independence can exist when your worth as a human being depends on complete submission to some all-powerful authority. In fact, I'd argue that much of authoritarian Christianity functions through the same psychological dynamics we see in what has come to be known as Stockholm Syndrome. It's a powerful emotional attachment formed under conditions of dependency, fear, and control. Whether or not that label is the perfect clinical fit, the pattern is very difficult to ignore. Now, before anyone objects that believers simply know that God is real because they've felt God's presence, it's worth remembering that powerful spiritual experiences don't automatically prove supernatural causes. I've talked before about neuroscientist Michael Persinger, who famously developed what's often called the God helmet. It's a device designed to stimulate parts of the temporal lobes. Now, while the results have been debated a bit, many participants reported sensing an unseen presence, or they had these profound spiritual feelings. Now, we also know that certain forms of temporal lobe epilepsy can also produce intensely religious experiences. None of that, to be clear, none of that proves God doesn't exist. But it does demonstrate something important. Feelings of awe, surrender, transcendence, and even the conviction that a divine being is present, well, all of those can arise from the human brain itself. Because those experiences can have very natural explanations, that means they can't serve as unquestionable evidence for supernatural authority. That means we're free to, and in fact we are obligated to, examine the religious system itself. And once we do, the similarities between authoritarian religion and psychological captivity become surprisingly difficult to simply dismiss. However, before we compare authoritarian religion to Stockholm Syndrome, I want to be clear about what these two terms actually mean. First, when I say authoritarian religion, I'm not just blanketly talking about everyone who believes in God or everyone who goes to church. I'm talking about religious systems that are built on a fairly simple premise. and that is ultimate authority belongs to someone or something else. Questioning that authority is treated as dangerous, and your value depends on your willingness to submit to that authority. Now, I was born and raised in the Catholic Church, and I have a master's in pastoral studies. After years of studying its history, theology, and development, I have come to believe that the Catholic Church operates as an authoritarian religious system. If that's the case, I'll be laying out here throughout this episode. All right, second, Stockholm Syndrome. It's a psychological response in which a captive or an abuse victim develops these feelings of trust or loyalty or even affection toward the person who controls or threatens them. Now, the term comes from a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, where several hostages unexpectedly defended their captors after being rescued. Now, although psychologists continue to debate whether this should be considered a distinct clinical diagnosis, the underlying pattern, well, it's been observed often enough to become very well known. Like I said, it's a coping mechanism that can develop when people are trapped in an abusive or a life-threatening relationship. Instead of resisting the captor, the hostages begin to identify with the captor, defend them, even feel gratitude and sometimes loyalty toward the very person causing the harm. Now, that response sounds pretty irrational from the outside, but it isn't. When escape feels impossible, the human brain shifts from fighting the threat to simply surviving the threat. If the captor occasionally shows mercy or offers comfort or just chooses not to inflict harm, well, those small acts can be interpreted by the captive's brain as evidence of love or compassion. And over time, the hostage's emotional survival becomes sort of tied to maintaining this relationship with the captor. Now, 4 conditions typically make that dynamic possible. First, there has to be a serious perceived threat to a person's physical or psychological well-being. Right? The hostage believes the captor holds the power over life, death, or their future. Second, the captor occasionally provides kindness, protection, or mercy. Those moments become emotionally magnified because they happen under this shadow of fear. Third, the hostage becomes isolated from competing perspectives. Friends, family, or outside sources of information are limited, making it harder to question the captor's version of reality. And finally, the hostage believes there is no real escape. Resistance seems hopeless, so adapting psychologically, well, that becomes the safest path. Now, none of this means the hostage is weak or foolish. It is quite the opposite, in fact. These are remarkably human survival strategies. The mind does what it has to do to endure an environment where power is radically unequal. Now, here's the question that really matters. What happens if an institution, without ever taking a hostage physically, what happens if an institution systematically recreates those same psychological conditions? That's the possibility we're going to look at right now. So let's line up those 4 conditions next to one of Christianity's most beloved passages, Romans chapter 8, verses 35 through 39, which we read in our main episode this week. For countless believers, these verses are considered comforting. But viewed through a psychological lens, I think they reveal something a hell of a lot more unsettling. All right, the first condition for Stockholm Syndrome is the threat. All right, so authoritarian religion begins by convincing people they have a fatal condition that they can't cure themselves. You know, whether it's called original sin or total depravity or simply being fundamentally broken, the diagnosis is always the same. You are in mortal danger. The punishment varies by tradition, right? Hell, eternal separation from God, spiritual death. But the message is remarkably consistent. Without the prescribed solution, you're doomed. That's the captor's gun. That's the imminent threat. Now, the second condition for Stockholm Syndrome is mercy. Right? So after establishing the threat, the system introduces grace. Suddenly we're told that nothing will be able to separate us from the love of God. Christians understandably find enormous comfort in those words. But from a secular perspective, an uncomfortable question emerges. Who created the danger in the first place? If someone threatens your life and then expects lifelong gratitude because they decided not to carry out the threat, we don't usually call that love. We might call that coercion. The rescuer receives endless praise for saving people from a crisis that the system itself created and declared unavoidable. And that's the captor's breadcrumbs. And those moments of mercy are emotionally amplified by the religious system. All right, the third condition is isolation. Now, most authoritarian religious organizations, authoritarian churches, they're not cults that go to the extreme of keeping people completely separated from the outside world. No, what they do is explicitly warn members against trusting secular ethics or trusting science or philosophy or higher education or even their own reasoning when it conflicts with doctrine. If it contradicts what we've told you, don't trust it. It's from the devil. It's from Satan. Doubt becomes temptation. Critical thinking becomes pride or hubris. Outside voices become worldly deception. The result isn't just disagreement with other worldviews. It's an intellectual quarantine. If every competing perspective is portrayed as spiritually dangerous, well, the institution becomes the safest and eventually the only trusted source of truth. Finally, the last condition is the inability to escape. Look, in an ordinary hostage situation, escape remains at least theoretically possible. Right? You might run or negotiate, you might be rescued. Not here. The authority, the captor, is described as all-knowing, all-powerful, and present everywhere. Every thought you have is observed. Every action you take is judged. Even death itself is not an exit. According to the theology, death just puts you into the final courtroom. There is literally nowhere to go outside the system's jurisdiction. Seen individually, each of these ideas, well, they might appear meaningful or even comforting. Taken together, however, they form a remarkably familiar psychological pattern. Overwhelming threat, conditional relief, isolation from competing perspectives, and the belief that escape is impossible. Whether you accept the comparison or not, it's at least worth asking a difficult question. Does this describe a relationship built on freely chosen love, or one that's sustained by dependency, fear, and the surrender of personal autonomy? Look, if you really want to understand a belief system, don't start with its claimed miracles or even its supernatural stories. Start with its vocabulary. The words people repeat week after week after week tell you what kind of relationship they're being asked to accept. So let's consider some of Christianity's most familiar titles: Lord, King, Savior. None of those are democratic terms. They aren't the language of partnership, friendship, or mutual respect. They are political titles that were born out of monarchies and empires, societies built on hierarchy, obedience, and concentrated power. A king doesn't ask you for your fucking opinion. A lord doesn't negotiate as an equal. Both expect loyalty, submission, and the surrender of any sort of competing authority. Yet hundreds of millions of believers around the world joyfully proclaim, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, or Jesus is King of the universe. And I don't think they ever truly stop to consider what those words actually mean. Strip away the stained glass, the soaring music, and all the comforting rituals, and the language itself remains unmistakably authoritarian. It celebrates the highest virtue, not being cooperation, empathy, fairness, integrity, or curiosity, but being obedient. Its highest virtue is obedience. Then there's the title Savior. A savior only makes sense if there's something catastrophic to be saved from. In authoritarian theology, that catastrophe is eternal separation from God. But notice the circular logic. The same system that creates the danger also provides the rescue. The authority creates and declares the emergency, then offers itself as the only acceptable solution. Imagine someone locking every exit to a building, chaining the doors shut, then lighting a fire and expecting applause for unlocking the front door. We wouldn't call that heroism. We'd ask some uncomfortable questions about who locked all the frickin' exits and then started the fire. Lord, King, Savior. These titles matter. Language doesn't merely describe reality. It also shapes reality. When people repeatedly define themselves as subjects before a king, or servants before a lord, or helpless dependents before a savior, they're reinforcing a worldview in which autonomy is treated as rebellion and submission is treated as virtue. For anyone who values freedom, well, shit, that's worth examining. Because the words we normalize eventually become the ideas we stop questioning. Now, here's an even bigger problem. The psychological habits cultivated by authoritarian religion don't necessarily stay inside the church walls. Once people are taught that the highest virtue is obedience, that questioning authority is dangerous, and that rewards come to those who faithfully endure hardship, well, those same habits become remarkably useful to other systems that depend on our compliance. That's one reason authoritarian religion and predatory economic systems have so often found themselves on the same side of history. A workforce that's been conditioned to accept hierarchy without question, well, that's a lot easier to exploit than a workforce full of people who have been taught to think critically, organize collectively, and demand accountability. If your highest calling is simply to obey, well, someone else will always be eager to tell you whom to obey. Modern corporate churches often reinforce that pattern by marketing certainty itself. Life is confusing. The world is changing. Instead of helping people develop the confidence to wrestle with difficult questions, most of these authoritarian religious institutions offer ready-made answers. Look, don't think too hard. Don't doubt. Trust the leaders. Trust the system. Trust God's plan. For people whose intellectual confidence has already been undermined, certainty becomes a product that's surprisingly easy to sell to them. The irony is hard to miss. The Isaiah reading we explored in our main episode invites everyone to receive what truly satisfies without money, without price. The feeding of the 5,000 celebrates a community where people freely share what they have so that no one goes hungry. Yet many modern religious empires operate according to the logic of corporate extraction. Bigger buildings, bigger brands, bigger donation campaigns. The institution grows wealthier while members are told that the next donation or the next conference or the next campaign, that will finally bring the peace they've been promised. It's the same business model used by countless predatory industries. Keep people anxious, convince them they're incomplete, and then sell them the cure. Real freedom doesn't require purchasing certainty from someone else. Real freedom begins when people trust themselves and are curious enough to ask difficult questions, when they're willing to cooperate and work together as equals, when they can focus on building communities that create abundance instead of dependency. If my comparison has any merit, my comparison between authoritarian religion and Stockholm Syndrome, if it has any merit, then the solution isn't simply to leave one religion and join another, or to replace one ideology with a different authority figure. The real challenge is a hell of a lot deeper. The real challenge is learning to reclaim ownership of your own mind. As far as I'm concerned, that means firing the cosmic captor, the invisible guy in the sky. It means rejecting the idea that you are somehow fundamentally broken, or that you are incapable of moral reasoning, or somehow unworthy unless an outside authority declares you acceptable. That's psychological extortion. That's not liberation. A system that starts by convincing you that you're powerless and then offers itself as the only source of worth, that system isn't creating free human beings. It's creating dependency. Real independence begins when you recognize that your value isn't granted from above. Your value is inherent in your humanity. Your capacity for cooperation, empathy, fairness, integrity, or curiosity doesn't require a king's permission. It requires the courage to think honestly, to question fearlessly, and to accept responsibility for the consequences of your choices. That's certainly more difficult than simply obeying. There is no cosmic rule book that answers every question for us. We have to learn to wrestle with complexity. We have to listen to people who disagree with us. We have to admit when we're wrong. But that's also what makes human freedom meaningful. A moral decision only has value if it can genuinely be chosen. So here's a thought. Maybe the real opposite of authoritarian religion isn't atheism. Maybe the opposite of authoritarian religion is autonomy. It's building a life guided by evidence instead of dogma, by empathy instead of fear, by shared human responsibility instead of unquestioning obedience. Building a life that recognizes that if we want a more just world, there is no invisible ruler coming to build it for us. We have to do that work ourselves. That's the invitation of humanism. Not to replace one master with another, but to become mature enough to stand on our own feet, to work alongside one another as equals, and to create the kind of community we've long wished someone else would create for us. That, to me, is what genuine freedom looks like. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at the Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for different age groups. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is a detailed resource designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes about 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, our freedom, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. The opposite of authoritarian religion isn't atheism. It's autonomy. Real freedom begins the moment you stop asking, who should rule me, and start asking, how can we flourish together? That's the difference between authoritarian religion and humanism. That is today's Afterthought. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.